There are moments in television history that don't just entertain people, they quietly reshape how millions of viewers think about talent, judgment, and human emotion. And one of those moments didn't happen on a scripted stage or in a carefully planned film. It happened unexpectedly when a man known for his cold precision in judging talent suddenly broke down in tears. Simon Cowell was never the type of public figure associated with emotional vulnerability. For years, his reputation was built on sharp critiques, blunt honesty, and an almost unshakable expression of control. In the world of talent shows, he was the final word, the one who could elevate a contestant or end their dreams with a single sentence. People didn't expect softness from him. They expected certainty. So, when Simon Cowell appeared visibly emotional, struggling to contain tears during a discussion about Susan Boyle, it didn't just surprise audiences, it unsettled them. Something about that moment felt bigger than television. It felt personal, like a hidden layer of humanity had suddenly been exposed. But to understand why that moment carried so much emotional weight, you have to go back to where the story really begins, not with fame, not with applause, but with an unknown woman from a quiet Scottish town who would later change the meaning of the word expectation. Susan Boyle did not enter the world as a celebrity, nor did she grow up surrounded by attention or privilege. Her early life was shaped by modest surroundings, family responsibility, and challenges that most people outside her community never saw. She lived in a world where dreams were often private, not public, and where ambition was something carried quietly rather than displayed loudly. From a young age, Susan showed a deep connection to music. It wasn't something she pursued for attention or validation. It was something that felt natural, almost essential to her identity. She would sing in small spaces, in church gatherings, and in moments of solitude where her voice could exist without judgment. But the world around her did not always make space for that kind of expression. She grew up facing learning difficulties, something that shaped how others perceived her long before they understood who she truly was. That misunderstanding created barriers, social ones, emotional ones, and sometimes even personal ones. In a world that often judges quickly, Susan learned early what it meant to be underestimated. But what many people didn't see was how those experiences shaped her inner strength. Instead of breaking her spirit, they built something quieter but far more enduring: resilience. She didn't become loud to compensate. She became steady. She didn't chase attention. She held onto her passion privately, letting it grow in its own time. Life was not easy for her. Family responsibilities, personal losses, and years of living away from any kind of spotlight meant that her journey was not defined by opportunity, but by patience. She spent much of her early adulthood caring for her family and navigating a life that rarely aligned with personal ambition. Yet, even in that environment, music never left her. She continued to sing not because she believed the world was watching, but because it was part of who she was. That alone makes her later rise even more extraordinary, because nothing about her early life suggested sudden fame. Nothing suggested global recognition. And yet, life has a way of surprising even the most patient souls. Everything changed the moment she stepped onto the stage of a talent competition that would become one of the most talked about auditions in modern television history. But when Susan Boyle walked onto that stage, the audience didn't react with expectation. They reacted with doubt. She didn't fit the image people had been conditioned to associate with stardom. She didn't carry the polished confidence of a trained performer. She didn't present herself as someone who had already been validated by the world. Instead, she stood there as she was, simple, quiet, and unassuming. And that is where the judgment began. People whispered. Some smiled in disbelief. Others exchanged looks that suggested they had already made up their minds. Even before she sang a single note, she was being placed into a category that had nothing to do with talent. But then something happened that no one in that room was prepared for. The music started, and Susan Boyle began to sing. The first notes of "I Dreamed a Dream" filled the space, and in that instant everything shifted. The energy in the room changed so abruptly that it felt almost physical. Conversations stopped. Smirks disappeared. Doubt didn't just fade, it collapsed entirely. What replaced it was silence. A stunned, almost disbelieving silence. Because what people were hearing did not match what they had assumed. Her voice was not just good, it was powerful, controlled, and emotionally charged in a way that felt far beyond expectation. It carried pain, hope, and something deeply human that could not be manufactured or rehearsed. And in that moment, the audience wasn't watching a contestant anymore. They were witnessing a revelation. Even Simon Cowell, a man known for his controlled and often critical demeanor, was visibly taken aback. The reaction on his face said what words could not. This was not what he expected. This was not what anyone expected. But the most powerful part of that moment wasn't just the performance itself. It was the realization that judgment had been so quickly and so confidently misplaced. The contrast between appearance and ability became impossible to ignore. As the performance reached its emotional peak, something changed in the room again. The skepticism was gone entirely, replaced by awe. And when the final note ended, there was a pause, just a brief moment where the audience seemed unsure whether they had just witnessed reality or something closer to magic. And then came the explosion of applause. That audition didn't just launch Susan Boyle into fame. It redefined how millions of people understood the concept of first impressions. Overnight, she became a global symbol of unexpected talent, and her name spread across media outlets worldwide. But fame, as history repeatedly shows, is never just about applause. It is also about pressure. Suddenly, Susan Boyle was no longer living a private life. She was living under a global spotlight. Interviews, headlines, expectations, and scrutiny became part of her daily reality. The same world that had once overlooked her was now watching her every move. And that shift came with challenges that were far more complex than most people realized. For someone who had spent much of her life in quiet environments, the intensity of global attention was overwhelming. Every appearance was analyzed. Every expression was interpreted. Every detail of her life was suddenly open for public discussion. But behind the headlines, there was a human being trying to adjust to a life that had changed almost overnight. Susan faced emotional strain, anxiety, and moments of uncertainty. The pressure of maintaining public expectations while managing personal well-being became an ongoing struggle. Fame, which often appears glamorous from the outside, revealed its more complicated reality. And during this period, something else began to develop, an evolving relationship between Susan Boyle and Simon Cowell. What started as a simple judge-contestant dynamic gradually transformed into something more layered. Simon Cowell had witnessed her rise from the very beginning. He had seen the doubts, the shock, and the transformation that followed her performance. But over time, his perspective shifted from evaluation to understanding. He began to see not just a performer, but a person navigating an extraordinary and often overwhelming experience. And Susan, in turn, recognized that beneath his tough exterior was someone who genuinely respected her journey. Their interactions carried a sense of mutual acknowledgement, an understanding that went beyond television roles. There was admiration, but also something deeper, recognition of struggle. Simon Cowell later reflected on how Susan's journey affected him personally. He admitted that her story stayed with him far longer than most contestants he had encountered. It wasn't just her voice that made an impact, it was her life, her resilience, and the emotional truth behind her rise. And this is where the emotional weight of his later reaction begins to make sense. Because over time, Simon Cowell didn't just witness success, he witnessed the cost of that success. He saw how rapidly fame can transform a life and how fragile that transformation can be when it happens without preparation. Susan Boyle's story was no longer just about an audition. It had become about endurance. She faced health challenges as well, including a diagnosis on the autism spectrum that helped explain many of the social difficulties she had experienced throughout her life. For her, this was not a limitation, it was an explanation. a way to better understand herself in a world that often felt overwhelming. But even with that understanding, the pressures of fame did not disappear. They only became more complex. There were moments of withdrawal, moments of exhaustion, and moments where the demands of public life clashed directly with her need for personal stability. Yet she continued forward, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. And throughout this journey, Simon Cowell remained one of the figures who observed her evolution most closely. He saw the impact of media attention. He saw the emotional toll. And he saw something else as well, a quiet strength that never left her, even when circumstances became difficult. This is what made his emotional reaction years later so significant. When Simon Cowell broke down in tears while reflecting on Susan Boyle's journey, it wasn't about a single performance anymore. It was about everything that followed it. It was about realizing the depth of what she had endured and the humanity behind the public image. For someone who built a career on judgment and critique, that moment represented something rare, emotional acknowledgement, not of talent alone, but of life experience. Because Susan Boyle was never just a viral moment. She was a reminder that people carry histories that cannot be seen at first glance. That success is not always simple, and that behind every unexpected rise, there is often a story filled with struggle, persistence, and quiet determination. Her journey also forced a broader reflection within the entertainment industry itself. It challenged assumptions about appearance, age, and the criteria used to define talent. It exposed the limitations of quick judgment and reminded audiences that real ability often exists beyond surface-level expectations. Simon Cowell's reaction became symbolic of that realization, a moment where even someone accustomed to evaluating others had to confront the emotional depth behind a contestant's life. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of this entire story is not fame or judgment or even success. It is transformation. Susan Boyle's life transformed from quiet anonymity to global recognition. Simon Cowell's perspective transformed from detached judgment to emotional awareness. And audiences around the world were reminded that human stories are rarely as simple as they appear. Today, the legacy of that moment continues to resonate, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. It reflected something universal, how quickly we form opinions, and how often those opinions are challenged when we look deeper. And in that reflection lies the true impact of Susan Boyle's journey and Simon Cowell's emotional response. A reminder that behind every voice, every face, and every first impression, there is always more waiting to be understood.